The story begins in the desolate realm of the dead, a place known as Necropia. This forsaken domain, devoid of any trace of life, stretched endlessly with barren lands. Yet, amid this bleak landscape, a single imposing castle stood tall, defying the gloom. It was the only castle in all of Necropia, a fortress filled with unimaginable wonders. Inside, endless golden pillars gleamed, adorned with exquisite ornaments and murals, their beauty a stark contrast to the desolation outside. The grand marble hall sprawled beneath, while intricately crafted sculptures lined its walls, each a masterpiece of glorious detail. But among all these marvels, one stood supreme, the symbol of ultimate authority, the master of the realm itself. At the heart of Necropia, the absolute ruler reigned, the Death King Karnak. King Karnak, who had transcended all and mastered the very essence of death, came to a profound realization after a century: humans were never meant to wield such power. In his mortal days, Karnak had been the illegitimate child of a disgraced noble family. He lost his mother at a young age and, in the face of relentless pressure and scorn from other nobles, grew isolated, learning to trust only himself. This isolation fueled an insatiable hunger for power. In time, Karnak discovered a forbidden codex on necromancy, which led him down a dark path, far from his humanity. Consumed by his newfound abilities, Karnak unleashed death upon the world, driving both its people and the kingdom itself to their end. The fourth martial king and the three grand mages had fiercely resisted Karnak, but in the end, even they succumbed, becoming his subjugated followers. The world's guardians also rose to challenge him, but when Karnak finally enslaved the last of them, the Dragon Emperor Greatoria, his victory was complete. In an act of ultimate defiance against the natural order, Karnak transmuted his own flesh into the ultimate ascendant being known as Astra Schnapf. With this transformation, the most powerful undead entity and the strongest Death King to ever exist was born. Reflecting on these events, Karnak had once believed that everything was now his, that he could finally revel in his absolute power. But 70 years had passed since that triumph, and instead of fulfillment, Karnak found himself trapped in a hollow existence. Despite his unrivaled might, he could do nothing. Reduced to a body made of mere bones, he was incapable of experiencing any joy or satisfaction in the world he had conquered. In that moment, Karnak pondered how much longer this pointless existence could continue. His thoughts drifted back to the time when he had still been human, when he could feel the warmth of the sun on his skin and the gentle caress of the breeze. He remembered the comforting touch of another person, the warmth of human connection. Alongside those memories, however, came the recollection of terrible pain, a searing agony that pierced his flesh. Yet even that pain, Karnak realized, was preferable to the dry, hollow life he now endured. Just as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Karnak's gaze shifted toward a mysterious monument in the distance. A glimmer of hope flickered within him. He reminded himself that his long-devised plan might still succeed. If it did, Karnak believed he could once again experience the sensations of life, the warmth, the wind, and even the pain, that had once defined his existence. At that moment, one of King Karnak's subordinates, Baros, the head commander of the Legion of Death, approached and greeted him. With reverence, Baros addressed Karnak as Lord of all the dead, ruler of life and death, and conqueror of the lands. Karnak then informed Baros that all preparations were complete. Baros was taken aback, surprised to hear the news. Sensing his commander's reaction, Karnak added, I have a good feeling about it this time. Hearing this, Baros couldn't contain his excitement. The long-awaited plan they had been working on was finally about to come to fruition, and the prospect of what was to come filled him with eager anticipation. At that moment, Karnak reflected on his long quest to regain the pleasures of the flesh, a journey he had shared with Baros. They had experimented with countless methods, turning Karnak into a vampire, attempting to possess a human body, but nothing had worked. He realized that pleasure arises from fulfilling what one lacks, and for beings like them, ascended beyond mortality, no method could satisfy their needs. However, Karnak believed that because they were the ultimate ascendants, there was still a way to reclaim their lost sensations. If they could no longer experience human pleasures because they were no longer human, Karnak resolved to change that by turning back time, returning to the days when he had been mortal. With this realization, Karnak turned to Baros and said, we will likely go back to the moment when I first gained the mana of darkness. Baros, hearing this, could barely contain his anticipation, knowing that this was the key to their plan and their chance to regain what they had long sought. Upon hearing this, Baros asked Karnak if their plan meant they would disappear from existence if they failed. Karnak raised an eyebrow and inquired why Baros was asking such a question. He added, "Do you still have regrets in life?" Baros quickly replied, insisting that he had no regrets. "This is all or nothing," he declared, determination in his voice. Satisfied, Karnak nodded, stating that it was time for them to return to the days when they were still human. With a shared sense of purpose, they activated the monument spell, and in an instant, a brilliant light enveloped them, illuminating the dark expanse of Necropia. Moments later, Karnak lay unconscious on the floor when he suddenly heard a voice calling out to him, urging him to wake up and referring to him as Master. As he opened his eyes, he saw a human face and asked, "Is that you, Baros?" Baros confirmed it was indeed him, adding that it had been a long time since he had assumed a human form. As Baros gazed at Karnak, he remarked that Karnak's face looked scrawny and pompous, just like in the old days. In response, Karnak shot back that Baros still had no sense of respect. Karnak shifted the conversation and told Baros that if they had arrived at the right moment, they would be at the very beginning of everything. As he spoke, he noticed a book lying on the table and confirmed that they were indeed in the correct time period, the start of it all. He then mentioned that he had followed the path of necromancy using the knowledge from that very book. In that moment, Karnak decided to take action. He focused his magic and set the book ablaze right there on the table. Baros, witnessing this, asked Karnak if it was wise to have burned the book. Karnak assured him that it was fine since he had remembered everything from it anyway. Karnak then explained to Baros that the book was forbidden, but not much of its content was truly significant. He concluded that it was better to dispose of it rather than risk having to deal with it later. At that moment, Baros remarked that he had already planned everything out and added that Karnak looked more handsome than usual. This compliment filled Karnak with pride. However, just then, Baros's stomach began to grumble. Upon hearing the sound, Karnak noted that it had been a long time since he had heard such a noise, and Baros felt a rush of excitement at being hungry again. Karnak suggested they should find some food, and Baros eagerly agreed. As they entered the town and made their way to a local restaurant, their excitement filled the air with shouts of joy, exclaiming how delicious the food was. While eating, Karnak inquired about the secret behind the restaurant's barley bread, praising it as a masterpiece. Baros, delighted, relished the food he had longed to taste. Meanwhile, the other patrons looked on in confusion at the spectacle of the two. At that moment, both Karnak and Baros were overwhelmed with emotion, tears streaming down their faces. Baros exclaimed that the food was so good he could die for it. Wiping his tears away, Karnak reassured him that they weren't going to die, as he had revived them for a reason, so they could experience moments like this again. At that moment, Baros told Karnak that it was fortunate they had gambled their lives, as it had all been worth it. Holding his food, he added that the taste was so incredible it brought tears to his eyes, blurring his vision. Karnak nodded in understanding but cautioned Baros to watch how much he was eating, reminding him that money doesn't just fall from the sky. As he spoke, tears of joy streamed down his face from the exquisite flavors. Baros replied that Karnak should also slow down, but Karnak insisted he felt like fainting from joy just from the aroma of the food. Just then, a waiter emerged with a beautifully presented dish for another table, and both Karnak and Baros were taken aback by how delicious it looked. Karnak turned to Baros and asked if the food being served to the other customers was chicken. He was taken aback by the restaurant's upscale atmosphere. Baros, drawn in by the tempting aroma of the dishes, remarked on how delicious everything smelled and wondered aloud how much it might cost. Karnak, however, quickly replied that there was no way they could afford such luxurious food, explaining that he hailed from a fallen noble family. At that moment, a menacing smile crept across Karnak's face as he suggested to Baros that they could simply eliminate everyone in the restaurant to enjoy the food without restraint. Baros, panicking at the suggestion, quickly urged Karnak to reconsider, insisting that they shouldn't even think about it. He emphasized that given their current strength, they would likely end up beaten to a pulp. Karnak, upon hearing this, reluctantly agreed with Baros's assessment. Baros informed Karnak that he would check their remaining funds. As he rummaged through the bag where they kept their money, he lamented that it was not enjoyable being poor. However, at that moment, he was shocked by what he found inside the bag. Turning to Karnak, he said they had a problem. Concerned, Karnak asked him what the problem was. Baros then suggested that their time travel might have affected certain things. As Karnak glanced at the bag containing the money, he agreed, noting that the situation was definitely strange, given the amount of money inside. He pointed out to Baros that there was no way the two of them could possess this much money. At that moment, the bag was overflowing with silver coins. At that moment, Karnak began to wonder where things had gone wrong. As he reflected on his past, he recalled that his Jestard family had been facing financial difficulties and were poor at that time. His grandfather, Baron Grellet, had launched numerous businesses within their territory but failed in all of them, leaving only debts for Karnak's father, Baron Krapet. Unfortunately, Karnak's father lacked the ability to manage the ever-growing debts, and his original wife's two sons were useless brats who contributed nothing to the family. As the illegitimate child born into this crumbling household, Karnak endured scorn and persecution, barely managing to survive each day. At that moment, Karnak thought this was how his family's situation should have been in the present, but he was confused because that was not the case. He wondered where the money in the bag had come from. Karnak then told Baros that this was not something to celebrate and asked if the time-regressing spell had gone wrong. Baros replied that he was uncertain and added that, as a swordsman, he did not know much about such matters. This irritated Karnak, who thought to himself that they had not returned to the past, yet there were too many similarities with his memories. At that moment, as Karnak pondered the situation, Baros interrupted him, asking if this meant they could finally eat the chicken. Baros had been going crazy from the scent of the chicken since earlier. Hearing this, Karnak's expression changed, and he felt a surge of excitement. Baros then pointed out that worrying about their current situation was pointless, as their concerns wouldn't disappear just because they refrained from using the money. Karnak agreed with Baros and added that they needed to eat well to tackle their problems, suggesting they should order at least one chicken for themselves. Both of them were drooling at the thought of the meal. Karnak raised his voice and ordered the waiter to serve them 2 whole chickens each. After a short while, both of them were satisfied, having eaten to their heart's content. They were now riding on a horse, and Baros remarked that his stomach was full and he was on the verge of a food coma. Karnak added that he would be able to pass out and sleep once they got back. At that moment, Baros's expression changed as he told Karnak that the prospect of facing his family again was somewhat annoying, and he was not looking forward to seeing them, suspecting they might be just as they had always been. Karnak then noted that the two of them would be fine as long as they managed to ingratiate themselves with the family. He emphasized that the situation was quite strange. Baros agreed, pointing out that it wasn't just 1 or 2 things that were odd. He mentioned that the station manager they had encountered recently was also fawning over them, assuring them that he would make sure to feed their horses well. Baros added that it made no sense for a fallen family like theirs to have horses of such good breed. The citizens they encountered were also behaving strangely. The very people who once hated them and called them scoundrels were now overly enthusiastic to see them, even tearing up at the sight of Karnak and Baros. Karnak expressed his unease at this unexpected reception, and Baros remarked that they would learn more about the situation once they reached home. After a short while, they finally arrived, and Karnak, gazing at his house, noted that he hadn't seen the place in a while and felt a strange sense of nostalgia. In contrast, Baros felt annoyed, pointing out that he and Karnak had no good memories associated with that place. At that moment, Karnak remembered that Baros was also an orphan who had never lived a comfortable life. Baros's parents were absolute scumbags, and it was Karnak who found him dying alone in the middle of the night before they abandoned him. Karnak took Baros home, and surprisingly, his father allowed it. Karnak reflected that, despite being an illegitimate child, his family needed to save face, and having an attendant of sorts could have been the reason his father permitted Baros to stay with him. At that moment, Baros called out to Karnak, looking puzzled as he asked if the place they were in was really the Jestard residence. Karnak confirmed that it definitely was, but upon looking at the house again, he was surprised by its appearance. Baros then questioned whether they had come to the wrong place, but Karnak denied it, insisting that this area was indeed the location of his memories. As Karnak observed his surroundings, he noticed the house was enclosed by a tall brick wall, featured a two-story building with a terrace, and was surrounded by an extensive garden. Everything he saw matched his previous memories of the house, except for one striking difference: the house was surprisingly splendid. Karnak then told Baros that it seemed the house had been completely spruced up, and he wondered where the money was coming from and how his family had acquired so much wealth when he clearly remembered them being poor in his previous life. Just then, one of the guards noticed Karnak and greeted him, surprising Karnak since he had never experienced this kind of acknowledgement before. Another guard quickly informed the first guard that he was not greeting Karnak correctly, and at that moment, they greeted him again, referring to him as their lord. Both Karnak and Baros were shocked, realizing that Karnak, who had once been treated poorly by everyone, was now being addressed as their lord. A few moments later, the two of them found themselves inside one of the rooms in the house, where a butler named Japel Plate informed Karnak that it had already been half a year since he had become the head of the family. Karnak and Baros were shocked to learn that Karnak had held this position for 6 months. The butler then asked Karnak if he had achieved his goal, leaving Karnak confused about what goal the butler was referring to. Japel explained that it was because of this very goal that Karnak had gone on a journey. Hesitantly, Karnak replied that he had somehow completed his goal, even though he did not fully understand what it was. Upon hearing this, the butler was pleased and remarked that this was truly good news, adding that the late Lord and Isabella would have been glad to hear it. At that moment, both Karnak and Baros were shocked to learn that Karnak's father and stepmother had already died. Butler Japel then added that after Tessel and Ferelth had passed away as well, times had looked grim, but he was feeling much better now. Karnak realized at that moment why he was the lord of the house. He wondered why this had happened and why his entire family had died. Karnak thought to himself that the goal of his journey was becoming clear: it must have been to master necromancy while no one was watching. At that moment, Baros whispered to Karnak, expressing disbelief that Karnak would reveal his goal so honestly to the butler. Karnak agreed, explaining that he must have fabricated some stories during his journey. He questioned why he would need necromancy in a situation like this. Japel, in a cheerful manner, asked what was troubling them. Baros then informed Japel that young Master Karnak was feeling exhausted from the long journey and suggested they continue the conversation the next day. Upon seeing Karnak sitting in the chair looking weary, Japel immediately apologized for not considering his fatigue and added that Karnak should rest well in his room for the day. After the butler left, Karnak and Baros high-fived each other, and Karnak praised Baros for a job well done. Baros then pointed out that while they had escaped for now, he was unsure of what to do next since everything the butler said was so new that he no longer knew what was happening. At that moment, Karnak reminded Baros that there was a method they could use in times like this, and Baros immediately understood what Karnak meant. Karnak told Baros that they both knew what they needed to prepare, urging him to hurry up so they could move and act while everyone was still asleep. Moments later, night had fallen, and everyone was asleep except for Karnak and Baros. They were now in Butler Japel's room, preparing to do something suspicious. Baros observed Butler Japel, whispering to Karnak that he was completely asleep. He then took out a bowl and informed Karnak that he had prepared the herbs, although it had taken him quite a while to gather the ingredients. Karnak then took the bowl and told Baros that it was time to commence the mind inspection. At that moment, he uttered the words, "Awaken my servant," and the bowl filled with herbs erupted in a burst of purple flames. The smoke that accompanied the purple flame wafted into Butler Japel's nostrils, causing him to rise while still unconscious. His body became enveloped in a blue magical flame, and he referred to Karnak as his master. Karnak then asked Japel to explain the entire process of how the Jestard family's finances had improved and how he had become the head of the household. Still unconscious, Japel spoke, informing Karnak that 4 years ago, while the second young master was training, he had coincidentally discovered a large copper mine. Both Karnak and Baros were taken aback by this revelation. Karnak remarked that he had always thought mines were just an excuse nobles used to conceal dirty money. Baros agreed, stating that while that was true, it seemed this was a genuine case where they had actually found a mine. Karnak then continued by asking Japel about the reason everyone in the family had died in such a short span of 4 years. Japel explained that the issue stemmed from the location of the copper mine, which was situated in the neutrality zone between the Jestard family and the Deventer family. Both families claimed the mine as their own, leading to a conflict that escalated into war. The Deventers had always been diligent with their military training, and no one could defeat Sir Randolph from their side. As a result, Sir Randolph easily killed Baron Crappet in battle, as well as young Master Tessel, the oldest son of the family. The household's best knight, the second young Master Ferelth, lost both his legs to Sir Randolph, and in his despair, Ferelth took his own life. Japel then added that the Baroness was shocked by all of this and passed away not long after. In the end, young Master Karnak was chosen to be the successor despite being a minor, and the two families promised a ceasefire until Karnak came of age and could take over as head of the household. However, everyone was still concerned about the copper mine and the promise of compensation for the war. It was at this point that young Master Karnak devised a solution to save the family. He announced his request for a trial duel against Viscount Deventer in the name of Allium, the goddess of the moon and justice. Both Karnak and Baros were taken aback by the news of the duel request, while Baros expressed that it was an incredibly rash decision. The trial duel was conducted under the mandates of the Allium Order, allowing for the substitution of a warrior in one's stead. It took place in the presence of an Allium priest, and the victor was determined only when one side was completely defeated. Upon hearing this, Baros told Karnak that he had dug his own grave. Karnak, in a state of disbelief, insisted that it was not he who had made that decision, but the past version of himself. In that moment, he realized this was why everyone had favored him. Karnak then told Baros that it was a losing fight and that this was precisely why he must have chosen this path instead of continuing the war. Karnak then pointed out that Deventer could not refuse such an offer, as it would ruin their image if they did. He further explained that if he were to win the duel and secure the copper mine, it would help them avoid starvation. However, Baros warned Karnak that with his current skill level, he was bound to end up dead. In response, Karnak stated that this was precisely why he intended to prepare as thoroughly as possible for the duel. He then asked Japel when the duel was scheduled to take place, and Japel informed him that it would be held within a month. Both Karnak and Baros were shocked by this revelation, realizing that the duel was too close for comfort and that they were in serious trouble. Moments later, a feast was prepared early in the morning, and Baros was excited to see this, prompting him to ask Karnak what it was all for. Karnak explained that he had arranged the meal for Baros, acknowledging that he had always worked hard and deserved it. Thrilled by this gesture, Baros thanked Karnak for the meal. As he ate, Baros asked if it was okay for Karnak to be resting like this, given how close the duel was. Karnak smiled at this concern and suggested that Baros could duel in his place. Upon hearing this, Baros stopped eating, realizing the true reason behind Karnak's kindness. Baros then told Karnak that he now understood that this was all just bribery, and he apologized, stating that he would not duel in Karnak's place. In that moment, Karnak begged Baros to reconsider, emphasizing that Baros had already defeated 3 of the 4 martial kings. However, Baros replied that he had achieved those victories thanks to Karnak's necromancy, asserting that he could not gain martial prowess from experience alone. He explained that it was as meaningless to learn advanced swordsmanship without arms as it was to think he could succeed without proper training. Baros added that, given a year to train, he might have been able to compete, but with the duel scheduled in just a month, he refused to participate in a fight he was certain to lose. Upon hearing Baros's refusal, Karnak took away the food Baros was eating and told him that since he wouldn't be participating in the duel, he could no longer enjoy this special meal. Baros immediately protested, telling Karnak not to be so petty. He suggested that Karnak could find someone in the Night Order to take his place. However, Karnak responded that he wouldn't be in this predicament if there had been anyone talented enough in the Night Order. Baros then pointed out that there was only one option left for Karnak, and that was to use necromancy. Baros, reflecting on their past, told Karnak that he now understood why Karnak had chosen to study necromancy. However, Karnak interrupted, pointing out that there was a serious issue: necromancy was forbidden. He then reminded Baros of an incident from their past when they were both on the run, pursued by people who had been promised a blessing from Allium if they managed to capture them. Fortunately, Karnak and Baros had been able to eliminate the entire household discreetly using necromancy. Despite their efforts, the priest of Allium singled Karnak out, convinced that he was a necromancer. Karnak was strong enough to stand his ground against the priest of Allium, managing to fend them off. During their time on the run, Karnak wondered how the priest had discovered his ability to use necromancy, especially since the book had clearly stated that no one should be able to detect it. However, after carefully reading the book, Baros informed him that this rule only applied to civilians, mages, and knights, while priests were an exception. Karnak was both confused and shocked to learn that such a condition existed. In the present, Baros remarked that their past had been truly tortuous, to which Karnak responded that it was the beginning of a legend. Baros then mentioned that he understood the plan for the upcoming duel, but Karnak clarified that the plan was to use necromancy discreetly while pretending to engage in normal combat. The issue, however, was that the judges for the trial duel would be priests of Allium, and Karnak feared that using necromancy in front of them would be repeating the same mistake from the past. He didn't want to live a life constantly on the run again. Baros suggested they should simply gather some money, escape, and that he would retrieve all the jewels and funds. Karnak responded to Baros, saying that running away would be a shameful act, especially since all the family members he despised were already gone, and the people there actually liked him. Hearing this, Baros questioned why Karnak was maintaining the good image, suggesting that Karnak could go ahead with it while Baros prepared a funeral for him. Karnak insisted that it wasn't an act and expressed frustration at Baros making him seem like a villain when he wasn't. At that moment, Karnak had an idea and told Baros to sit down and listen, as what he was about to propose might sound dangerous, but it was a brilliant plan. In the northern fort of Deventer, knights were training rigorously when a voice commanded them to halt, announcing that they would take a short break. The man giving the orders was Sir Randolph, the strongest knight of Deventer. One of the knights, Sir Bright, then asked Sir Randolph how the preparations for the upcoming trial duel were progressing. Sir Randolph, hearing this, replied that no preparations were necessary against someone as unskilled as Karnak. Sir Bright agreed but cautioned Sir Randolph not to let his guard down, suggesting that Karnak might have some sort of plan to counter him. Randolph grumbled that it was ridiculous for him to waste his time on a spoiled, foolish young master like Karnak, who knew nothing about the world. He assured Bright that there was nothing to worry about. Bright agreed, saying he didn't believe for a moment that Randolph would lose, but he still pointed out that the new lord, Karnak, must have some kind of plan when he requested the duel. Just then, both of them heard a man in the distance speaking with his customers. As they glanced toward the source of the voice, Bright mentioned to Randolph that it was just a merchant and noted that there had been an increase in outsiders around the front yard lately. He added that it was becoming a distraction before ordering the knights to resume their training. Meanwhile, the merchant smiled at the scene, as he was none other than Baros in disguise, spying on them. Baros thought to himself that it had been a smart decision to snoop around where Randolph was training. As he observed Randolph's techniques, Baros realized that while Randolph might be strong in combat, in a one-on-one battle, his opponent actually stood a chance of winning. Baros noted that Randolph seemed like the typical foolish type who relied on basic heavy sword techniques. To make things even better, Randolph hadn't yet mastered battle aura. His movements were predictable, and this gave Baros a sense of confidence that it would work to his advantage. Baros acknowledged that despite Randolph's many weaknesses, a month might not be enough time to exploit them fully. As he was lost in thought, a woman approached from behind and asked why he was staring so intently at her brother, Randolph. Startled for a moment, Baros quickly composed himself, greeted the woman, and asked if she was indeed Randolph's sister. She confirmed this and repeated her question about his business with Randolph. Baros immediately replied that he was simply admiring the strength and vigor of the North's strongest knight. In that moment, Baros quickly shifted the conversation, telling Randolph's sister that their meeting was a coincidence, as he was a merchant selling handkerchiefs. He asked if she might be interested in one, adding that he would offer her a special price. As she examined the handkerchiefs, she found them appealing and remarked that they looked good. Baros complimented her, saying she had an excellent eye for quality. Though Baros was briefly worried that she might have caught on to his true intentions, he was relieved when she showed no sign of suspicion. Moments later, Baros returned to the Jestard estate and made his way to the personal drill hall to check on Karnak's training progress. Upon seeing Karnak, he called out that he had returned and asked how the stamina training was going. However, he was immediately taken aback to find Karnak lying on the floor, appearing lifeless. Baros rushed over, concern etched on his face, and urged Karnak to wake up. Karnak, on the other hand, groaned and told Baros not to shake him so much, or he would risk losing his meal. After a few moments, Karnak began to feel slightly better. At that time, Baros asked if Karnak had completed the 50 laps around the drill hall as instructed. Karnak replied that he had just finished but collapsed because he could not run any further. Observing Karnak, Baros noted that he was lacking significantly in stamina. Karnak then asked Baros if there was even a reason for him to train so rigorously in the first place. Baros responded that with a frail body like Karnak's, he wouldn't be able to accomplish anything at that moment. He reassured Karnak that the training was not meaningless and encouraged him to keep pushing forward. Still looking lifeless, Karnak insisted that he needed a break, but Baros refused, stating that they were going to begin the real stamina training right then. Karnak, surprised by this, asked what he had been doing all this time, to which Baros replied that he had just been undergoing rehabilitation. With a menacing smile, Baros added that the real training was about to start now. As time passed, Karnak had only 20 days left until the duel, and his training continued. The first task each morning was to ensure he had a filling breakfast. After that, Karnak would head to the drill hall to complete 100 push-ups, followed by 100 pole swings and 100 squats. Once he finished these exercises, he would take a short break. Despite looking lifeless after completing the workouts, the training had to press on. After the break, Karnak would eat another meat-heavy meal before resuming his push-ups, pole swings, and squats, repeating the process over and over. As time passed, only 15 days remained until the duel, and it was evident that Karnak had made significant improvements. He could be seen doing squats with 2 sacks of rice on his shoulders. At that moment, Baros approached and remarked that Karnak seemed to have finally built some stamina. Karnak responded that this was only to be expected after so much training, although he acknowledged that he still fell short compared to Baros. Just then, Baros informed Karnak that it was time to begin sword training. Karnak felt a surge of excitement at the thought of finally learning how to use a sword properly. Baros then instructed Karnak to hold the sword and, upon observing him, remarked that his grip was a mess. He noted that Karnak's hands were trembling and asked what he was staring at. Baros emphasized the need for Karnak to relax his shoulders while holding the sword, put more weight into his heels, bend his knees further, and tense his arms. Karnak thought to himself that Baros was quite strict. However, after correcting his posture, Baros finally said that Karnak was starting to look decent. He added that if Karnak could maintain this stance, he would not be beheaded in a single attack. Baros then informed Karnak that he was going to attack, prompting Karnak to prepare himself. Karnak declared that he would counter Baros's attack, but just as he said this, Baros launched a powerful strike. As the impact hit him, Karnak realized how strong and quick Baros was. Undeterred, Baros continued his assault, asking Karnak what he was doing and instructing him to return to his stance. At that moment, Karnak thought to himself that Baros's relentless barrage made it difficult to counter effectively. He concluded that his only option was to focus on maintaining his stance. At that moment, Baros delivered a powerful attack to Karnak, sending him flying to the ground. Baros explained that this was why knights could easily overpower civilians. He emphasized that knights wouldn't give their opponents a chance to counterattack and that Karnak needed to hold his stance and dodge the subsequent attacks. Karnak acknowledged Baros's point but admitted that even if he could maintain his stance, he wouldn't be able to dodge the next attack. Baros agreed with him but added that the goal of their training was to demonstrate Karnak's fighting spirit to Randolph. Karnak then asked Baros if it was necessary for him to do that during the duel. Baros explained that Randolph had a habit of showing off. He would try to display his skills in front of the spectators while toying with his opponents. However, if Randolph's opponents lost their will to fight, it would damage his honor, so he preferred to defeat them quickly. Baros added that Karnak needed to demonstrate to Randolph that he would not give up. By doing so, Karnak would increase his chances of survival in the duel. As time passed, Karnak now had only 5 days left until the duel. He continued to train hard with Baros, giving it his all, but he still struggled to match Baros's skill and often found himself sent flying to the ground. 4 days remained, then 3, and finally 2, during which Karnak began to show improvement. Baros acknowledged his progress, telling him he was doing well, but Karnak expressed his concern that he might die before even facing Randolph. Baros reassured him that he was on the right track and that he was almost ready for the duel. At that moment, Baros announced that it was time for them to enter the final phase of training. Baros then informed Karnak that he was going to teach him the 4 martial king's sword technique. Confused, Karnak asked what that technique was and if Baros truly knew it. Baros confirmed that he did, explaining that the 4 martial kings had all been his underlings and that he had learned their techniques, except for that of martial king Rapisal. Curious, Karnak inquired why Baros had not learned Rapisal's technique. Baros replied that it was because Karnak had not turned her into a death knight. Rapisal had resisted until the end, and as a result, Karnak had cut her into thirds and made her a palace gatekeeper. At that moment, Karnak recalled what he had done to Rapisal and wondered if he had truly been that cruel in his past. Baros then told Karnak that he was going to learn Martial King Levune's Delphiod sword technique that day. Karnak expressed doubt, asking if it was really possible to master such a skill in just 2 days, given that it belonged to a martial king. Baros reassured him that he would not need 2 days. In fact, Karnak only needed 1 day to learn the technique. Time passed, and it was now the day of the duel. At the border of Deventer and Gestard, an arena had been set up for the duel. A crowd gathered in the area, eager to witness the upcoming confrontation. People were conversing among themselves, speculating on who would win the duel. One spectator from the Deventer side confidently declared that Sir Randolph would be the obvious victor but expressed a hope that the match wouldn't turn out to be boring and would instead be at least somewhat entertaining. Meanwhile, spectators from the Gestard side were concerned about Karnak's chances. One person asked if Karnak would win the duel, while another reassured them, saying they had heard that Karnak had been training very hard and that they simply had to believe in him. At that moment, Karnak and Baros arrived at the duel venue, both looking confident. As the crowd continued chatting, the priest of Allium stepped forward and instructed everyone to be quiet in the presence of the goddess. He announced that both houses had laid claim to the copper mines, prompting the request for this trial. The priest explained that ownership of the mine would be determined through combat. He then called for Karnak of House Gestard to step forward and face the goddess, followed by Sir Randolph of Deventer, who also came forward to stand before the priest. The priest added that before the fight commenced, a handicap in equipment would be applied based on the fighter's abilities, in accordance with the rules. The priest then asked both fighters if they were willing to pledge to fight honorably in the name of Allium, to which they both responded affirmatively. The priest continued, stating that with the warrior's pledge, may the scales of justice seek out the truth. At that moment, he announced that the trial by combat would begin, and Karnak and Randolph faced each other. Just then, Randolph launched an attack at Karnak, declaring that nothing would change, as he was destined to emerge victorious. Karnak, however, successfully blocked Randolph's strikes and retorted that they would only know the outcome once they both saw things through to the end. Randolph retreated momentarily and acknowledged that Karnak was not just all talk since he had managed to block his attacks. As the fight continued, the Gestard supporters grew excited, noting that their lord, Karnak, was putting up a decent fight. One of them remarked that there was something different about Karnak that day. Baros, observing from the sidelines, thought to himself that the match was progressing as expected. He noted that Randolph's attacks were not particularly fast or threatening, indicating that Randolph was still assessing Karnak's abilities. Meanwhile, Karnak felt a surge of confidence and reminded himself to stick to his training. At that moment, he resolved to show both the spectators and Randolph his unwavering will to fight. At that moment, Karnak screamed in anger, challenging Randolph to come at him. Randolph smiled upon hearing this and thought to himself that Karnak's eyes were filled with determination. Although he recognized that Karnak's skills were lacking, he admired his spirit. Randolph then told Karnak that he was going to take it up a notch. As he increased his sword energy, Karnak felt a surge of panic, realizing that he would not be able to block the impending attack with his shield. At that moment, as Randolph prepared to deliver a powerful attack, Karnak rolled out of the way, successfully dodging the blow. Randolph was taken aback by the crude skill Karnak had just displayed. The audience, equally impressed and surprised, marveled at Karnak's ability to evade the attack. Some remarked that they had never seen such skill before, while others praised their lord Karnak for his dexterity. Seizing the moment, Karnak threw aside his shield and declared that Randolph was nothing, insisting he didn't even need it to face him. He added that Randolph was so slow he had momentarily thought of him as a turtle. Karnak then taunted Randolph, suggesting he should be embarrassed to be called a knight while resembling a muscular pig. Randolph, enraged by the insult, vowed to silence Karnak for mocking him. However, Karnak responded confidently, telling Randolph to do his worst, as it would not deter him. At that moment, Karnak assumed a stance that shocked Randolph. It was the stance of the Delphiod sword technique. The spectators gasped at the sight, realizing that Karnak had adopted a stance associated with one of the four martial kings. They were thrilled at the possibility that Karnak might have been training with the techniques of the martial kings. The people on the Jestard side now felt a surge of hope that their lord, Karnak, might be able to win. Meanwhile, Randolph smiled to himself, realizing he had almost fallen for Karnak's taunt. He resolved to remain calm and focused. The sword techniques of the martial kings could only be wielded by geniuses with true battle experience, and Karnak was far from being capable of using them effectively. Randolph contemplated how Karnak had managed to learn the technique, but he believed it would not aid him in achieving victory in their fight. While Randolph acknowledged Karnak's effort in attempting to use the martial king's technique, he was confident that Karnak would not be able to defeat him that easily. Randolph pointed his sword at Karnak, declaring that he would enact justice in the name of Allium. Seeing Randolph glaring at him, Karnak felt a surge of panic, realizing that his current abilities might not be enough to take Randolph down. He recalled the time he had asked Baros whether it was possible to learn such a technique in just one day, given that it belonged to one of the four martial kings. Baros had assured him that he only needed to roughly copy the technique, but Karnak remained doubtful. Baros had further added that once this was over, Karnak wouldn't have to pick up a sword again. All he needed to do was demonstrate enough skill to convince everyone that he had been training, as their real plan lay elsewhere. Back in the present, Karnak questioned Baros about why he hadn't warned him that he would be beaten so badly by Randolph. However, he quickly changed his attitude, realizing that he still needed to focus on what needed to be done. Despite the pain and tears from the beating, Karnak defiantly told Randolph that this was nothing, insisting that it wouldn't be enough for Randolph to defeat the bloodline of House Jestard. Randolph, observing Karnak's battered state, couldn't comprehend his words. In that moment, Karnak declared that the sword of Jestard would never fall. As the battle continued, the spectators were moved by Karnak's actions and regretted having viewed him as incapable. The supporters from House Jestard were now emotional, shedding tears and expressing that even if Karnak was not the brightest, he was more than suitable to be their lord. Meanwhile, Baros wore a menacing smile, pleased that Karnak was avoiding direct hits and noting that all the time spent training him had paid off. He reflected on how Karnak had always had a knack for talking back, and even while being beaten, Karnak continued to taunt Randolph. Randolph, feeling increasingly irritated, thought to himself that he could not keep this up much longer. He then addressed Karnak, who was barely standing, and remarked that Karnak looked as if he were on his last breath, questioning why he was still talking back. Randolph charged at Karnak, declaring that it was time to end the fight. Baros, witnessing this, felt a surge of excitement and immediately shouted for Karnak to prepare himself. At that moment, Karnak wondered if this was indeed his time. He recalled Baros's words during training, where Baros had warned him that even if he could mimic the martial king's moves, without delivering a proper strike, everyone would see through his tricks. Baros instructed Karnak on exactly what he needed to do. He explained that Randolph would target Karnak's legs to end the fight, aiming to limit his movement. Baros emphasized that at the right moment, Karnak should shift into a defensive stance and stab his sword into the ground. Remembering this, Karnak followed the instructions precisely and successfully blocked Randolph's attack. Randolph was taken aback that a newcomer like Karnak could withstand his strike. Karnak recalled Baros's guidance to follow up by swinging his sword upward in a diagonal arc. As he executed this move, he switched his grip and struck again, managing to land a blow on Randolph and injure him. However, upon receiving the attack, Randolph laughed at Karnak and taunted him, asking if that was all he had. He added that a kitten's scratch would have been more effective. At that moment, Karnak felt the weight of the situation and wondered if this was the end for him. The spectators began to think that the fight was coming to a close. They murmured that miracles might not exist and that reality was both cruel and unfair. Randolph then told Karnak that he had let his guard down, certain that Karnak would be ridiculed by his peers. In response, Karnak asserted that he was risking his life in this duel, while all Randolph had to offer was mock concern. Karnak smiled darkly and told Randolph that the situation wasn't as dire as it seemed, adding that he wouldn't have to feel sorry for him afterward. Randolph was taken aback by Karnak's unsettling expression, and at that very moment, a black aura began to seep from the wound Karnak had inflicted earlier. Shocked, Randolph stared in disbelief as the eerie energy radiated from his body. The priest, witnessing the strange phenomenon, was equally stunned, while Randolph struggled to comprehend what the black aura meant, his confusion growing as the mysterious force continued to escape from him. Karnak shouted at Randolph, declaring that he didn't care what dirty tricks Randolph had up his sleeve, he was determined not to lose. With that, Karnak charged at Randolph. However, at that very moment, Randolph unleashed a powerful kick that sent Karnak flying backward. Confused, Randolph noticed that his legs seemed to move on their own. The audience gasped in shock, marveling at the immense strength displayed by a human. They began to wonder if the black aura surrounding Randolph was somehow under his control. That's all for today, thanks for watching.